On the morning of Arnaldo's 70th birthday, Elisa left Porto early with a small backpack and a rigid folder containing her college notes and a few papers no one else had wanted to see. She hadn't slept much, not because of a lack of bed. The mattress at the boarding house was hard but adequate, but because of that mixture of anxiety and fatigue that clings to your body when you're asked to return to a home where you'd been treated as if you were in the way. The bus to the Douro area was half empty. The smell of old rain came through the poorly sealed window, and the glass rattled at every turn. She wasn't thinking about grand speeches, just about staying calm, washing her face in the bathroom upon arrival, greeting her grandfather without trembling, listening to the usual comments without biting her tongue until it bled. She had decided that, whatever happened, that day wouldn't be another record of humiliations, but a clear inventory of how people hold on when no one is left on. And they sighed. The lot looked imposing from the road, with its damp stone walls and high shutters half open, as if the house were leering at anyone approaching. Elisa arrived with her shoes still wet and a knot in her stomach that wasn't hunger. She had eaten a quick toast in the boarding house kitchen, standing while the owner, an older man who didn't ask questions, heated water in a dented kettle. At the entrance to the living room, a cousin offered her an awkward, non-committal smile, and she responded with a brief nod so as not to prolong the moment. Inside, the bouquets seemed to be holding up other people's conversations. Helena, the mother, coordinated the details like someone directing a play rather than a family, and Marina moved among the guests with that confidence that always appealed to her. Elisa left her backpack behind a column, straightened the jacket she had gotten at a flea market, and took a deep breath. He knew that before lunch, the poisoned phrases disguised as courtesy would arrive, and he prepared himself to receive them without disturbing his pulse. The tables were arranged in long rows, with freshly ironed white tablecloths and glasses that gleamed in the dim light of antique lamps. Elisa sat in a corner, far from the center, and from there she watched her mother speak to neighbors and relatives in a forced voice, as if the daily life of shouting and scolding had never existed. The comments started quickly. An aunt asked why Elisa was so thin. Another insinuated that working in a hospital reception wasn't the same as having a real career. She looked down at her empty plate, remembering every shift at the clinic, every early morning at the public library, and understood that none of those sacrifices would win them applause there. But what hurt her most weren't the poisoned questions, but the low laughter that followed, as if it didn't matter that she could hear them. At one point, Marina approached in a new dress, with a triumphant air that contrasted with Elisa's simple clothes. She remarked in front of several cousins that she had received praise for her dedication at university, and that, unlike others, she knew how to take advantage of the opportunities the family offered. Elisa clutched her napkin so tightly that the edge tore. She didn't respond. She learned long ago that any word could be used against her. Meanwhile, Grandpa Arnaldo watched silently from his high-backed chair, his gaze fixed on her more than on the others. Elisa felt that weight, a mixture of discomfort and relief, as if someone was finally registering what was really happening in that room, disguised as a celebration. Elisa decided to step out into the garden for a moment to breathe away from everyone's eyes. The fresh Douro air carried a scent of wet earth that contrasted with the artificial perfume inside the living room. She leaned on the rusty iron railing and closed her eyes, trying to sort through the thoughts building in her throat. Laughter and music still drifted from inside, but in that corner she managed to let out a long sigh, like someone letting out the pressure of days without rest. It was there that she remembered everything she had been through since being kicked out of the house, and she promised herself that, even though that day might be tough, she would never let herself be treated like a nuisance again. If you're reading this far, please comment on which city or country you're with us from, so we'll know how far these stories of resistance reach. When she re-entered, the first courses had already been served and conversations were heated. Helena, holding a glass, was commenting on how lucky she was to have Marina, her pride, the daughter who constantly gave her joy. Each word was like a needle aimed at Elisa, who was listening from her spot in the corner. No one seemed to notice the effort she was making to remain calm, to keep from getting up and walking back out into the street with the same backpack as always. But then Grandpa slowly stood up, leaning on his cane, and asked for silence. The murmur died down like a candle suddenly blown out, and Elisa, her heart racing, understood that something different was about to happen. Grandpa Arnaldo sat in front of everyone, his deep voice always commanding respect, even among those who ignored him in their daily routine. He began by thanking each guest for their presence, recalling his life in the countryside, his years of work, and the value of honesty that, according to him, few in the family seemed to uphold. Elisa looked at him in surprise. She had never heard him speak so firmly in public. When her mother tried to interrupt with a joke, he raised his hand and asked to finish. The silence was absolute, and in that pause it was clear that something bigger than a simple birthday speech was about to be revealed. Arnaldo then turned his gaze directly on Elisa. With clear words, he denounced the injustice she had suffered, recalling aloud the day she was forced to leave the house, and how, since then, no one had shown compassion for her efforts. A murmur swept through the living room like a wave. Some lowered their heads, others looked incredulous. And that was when he announced that the family mansion would not remain in the hands of those who had acted arrogantly, but would be inherited by his granddaughter, Elisa. The impact was immediate. Glasses clinking, voices rising, Marina's face red with fury, and Helena, unable to hide her rage. Elisa, on the other hand, felt her legs tremble and a lump in her throat, but also a new strength she had never felt in that place. Helena reacted immediately, getting up from the table and saying that this was crazy, that Grandpa was confused by his age and couldn't make such important decisions in the middle of a party. Marina followed her, accusing Elisa of manipulating him with pity, of always presenting herself as a victim to curry favor. The atmosphere became tense, with guests murmuring among themselves, some trying to calm the situation and others taking the opportunity to criticize in low voices. Elisa remained still, without responding, her heart racing but her gaze steady. She understood that any word she said would be used against her. Grandpa, without losing his calm, repeated that the decision was already recorded in the will, and that all he was doing was putting an end to an injustice that had lasted too long. The news spread quickly among those present, and, as expected, it soon spread from that room to the streets and social media channels of the town. Within hours, Elisa was already the subject of conversations in cafes and family WhatsApp groups. Some congratulated her for finally receiving what she deserved. Others echoed Helena and Marina's version of events, portraying her as selfish. That same night, when she returned to the boarding house, there were already anonymous messages on her phone, some supportive, others filled with contempt. Elisa lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, tears burning her eyes, but also a growing determination. She understood that this inheritance was not a prize, but a responsibility that would demand more strength than ever. The following days turned into open warfare. Helena and Marina quickly initiated legal action to try to annul the will. They hired expensive lawyers, spread comments on social media insinuating that Elisa had manipulated her grandfather in a moment of weakness, and even sent her intimidating messages late at night. At the hospital, some colleagues who knew her family asked her uncomfortable questions, while others looked at her with suspicion. Elisa, however, had learned to write down every detail. She kept screenshots, archived messages, and began gathering testimonies from those who had witnessed how she had been treated for years. She wasn't seeking revenge, but defending her truth with facts. It was in this context that unexpected support appeared. Dr. Ricardo, who had already noticed her commitment to the hospital, offered her a recommendation so she could apply for an administrative position at a private clinic. With this opportunity, Elisa was able to improve her financial situation somewhat and begin setting aside money for legal expenses. She also met Livia at the public library, a volunteer teacher who invited her to a study group. There, Elisa found a space where she could review her college content without feeling judgment or competition. These small gestures of solidarity served as reminders that, even if her family had rejected her, there were still people willing to lend a hand. The tension reached a new peak when she received an official notification. She had to appear in court in Porto for the first hearing. That morning, Elisa arrived with an empty stomach because she hadn't had a single bite to eat. She was wearing a simple suit, borrowed from a colleague at the clinic, and carrying an envelope full of carefully arranged documents. Helena and Marina were there, accompanied by lawyers in impeccable suits and superior looks. While they waited to be called, the two kept making comments in low voices, harsh enough to hurt, but discreet enough to avoid being reprimanded. Elisa took a deep breath, telling herself that she couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her collapse in public. Inside the courtroom, the judge asked each party to present their arguments. Helena's lawyers alleged manipulation and questioned Arnaldo's lucidity at the time of signing the will. But soon, inconsistencies began to become apparent. Witnesses contradicting each other, poorly prepared documents, and an exaggerated tone that ultimately undermined her own claims. Elisa, on the other hand, calmly presented evidence of her unequal treatment within the family, the testimonies of people who had witnessed the abuse, and above all, the notary's legal record confirming her grandfather's clear will. The judge listened silently, taking notes, while she held the folder with her hands steady, aware that every word counted. In the middle of the court proceedings, there was a moment that remained etched in everyone present. The judge called a brief recess, and in that tense silence, Elisa looked up at the audience. There were neighbors, former classmates, and even a few curious onlookers who had come out of curiosity. Most of them watched her expectantly, as if waiting to see her break down. She stood tall, breathing controlled, and for the first time she felt not shame, but a kind of dignity that didn't depend on anyone's approval. When the judge returned to the courtroom and called for order, the air became almost unbreathable. Helena tried to interrupt once more, claiming that the will was a personal betrayal of her as a daughter. The magistrate, in a firm voice, reminded her that this wasn't a matter of emotions, but of legal facts. And at that moment, he issued the verdict. Arnaldo's will was valid, and Elisa was the legitimate heir to the mansion. The murmur was immediate. Some present applauded timidly, others left indignantly. Marina ran out of the courtroom with tears of rage, while Helena remained paralyzed, as if unable to accept that her entire strategy had collapsed. Elisa, her heart pounding, understood that this decision not only gave her a home back, but also opened up a different life for her. That night, upon returning to the boarding house, Elisa left, her backpack on the floor, and looked at herself in the small mirror hanging crookedly over the dresser. Her face was tired, but her eyes conveyed something new, a certainty that the struggle had been worth it. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like her life was hanging by a fragile thread, but rather that there was solid ground beneath her feet. She remembered her grandfather's voice echoing in the living room, the silence in the courtroom, and realized that day had marked a Before and after that would be impossible to erase. As the weeks passed, she began visiting the mansion. She walked through the empty hallways, touched the cold walls, and thought about everything that place had represented. Distance, rejection, painful comparisons. But now she had the chance to redefine it. She didn't want a palace to show off or a symbol of revenge. She wanted to open those doors to young people who, like her, had been underestimated or ignored in their own families. Little by little, with the help of the NGO that had mentored her and volunteers like Livia, she outlined a project to turn the house into an educational support center. With every decision she made, she felt she was paying silent homage to the grandfather who trusted her when no one else would. The project began with small but steady steps, cleaning the rooms, repairing leaks, painting walls that had been forgotten for years. Elisa rolled up her sleeves herself and, with the help of a couple of student volunteers, spent her weekends transforming the mansion into a habitable place. The echo of their laughter contrasted with the harsh memories that had been trapped within those walls. It wasn't easy. There were days when the exhaustion from work at the clinic and night classes left her feeling drained, but upon entering that house, she saw a purpose greater than herself, and that was enough to keep her going. Over time, the center began to welcome its first young people, students from low income. Families arrived looking for a quiet place to study, access to books, and above all, someone who believed in them. Elisa welcomed them with a mixture of humility and pride, offering what had previously been denied her: unconditional support, a place where they wouldn't be compared or humiliated. The news spread throughout the neighborhood, and little by little, the image of the discarded daughter transformed into that of a woman capable of turning pain into opportunity. Helena and Marina, increasingly isolated, watched from afar as the community recognized Elisa as an example of resilience. Recognition was also quick to arrive from local authorities. A counselor visited the center and was amazed to see how a space that had been in decline for years had been transformed into a meeting place for young people eager to study. That visit brought with it small grants, book donations, and even new furniture. Elisa, who had spent so much time being dismissed as a dead weight within her own family, was now seen as someone who generated solutions. This public validation didn't erase the scars, but it did give her renewed motivation to continue expanding the project. Meanwhile, her personal life was beginning to stabilize. She managed to move from the boarding house to a small apartment near the clinic, which allowed her to rest better and have a private space to recharge. Even so, she never shook off the memories of those days when she wandered aimlessly with a suitcase in her hand. Every time she entered the mansion's living room, which had been converted into a community library, she remembered that feeling of emptiness and thought about how much she had changed. It wasn't just about winning a lawsuit or inheriting a property. It was about proving, first to herself and then to the world, that she wasn't the burden they'd led her to believe. As the months passed, the support center became an indispensable space for many young people. Some managed to pass exams thanks to hours of study in the library. Others found there the confidence they lacked at home. Elisa listened to their stories and, in each one, recognized a piece of herself. This identification led her to give her all, organizing workshops, seeking donations, and managing activities that kept everyone motivated. The echo of conversations, the open books on the tables, and the discreet smiles reminded her that the house was no longer a symbol of exclusion, but of hope. Helena and Marina, on the other hand, sank into their own resentment. The friendships they'd once boasted about drifted away. Neighbors no longer saw them as exemplars of prestige, but as protagonists in a scandal gone wrong. There were attempts to regain their place in society, but each gesture seemed insincere and ended up generating more rejection. Elisa knew of these attempts through the comments that reached her, but she didn't waste any energy responding. She had learned that her victory lay not in proving anything to those who had rejected her, but in continuing to forge a different path. And on that path, the only thing that mattered was the people who benefited from her efforts, and the memory of her grandfather, who believed in her abilities. On the day marking 1 year since that party that changed her destiny, Elisa organized a small event at the mansion. She invited the center's students, volunteers, and some neighbors who had supported her from the beginning. There were no luxurious tablecloths or sparkling glasses, just simple tables with food prepared by everyone. However, the atmosphere was filled with genuine joy that contrasted with the coldness of the family gathering she remembered. That night, as she listened to the young people thank her for opening up a space of opportunity for them, she realized that this was the true legacy she had received from her grandfather, the ability to transform adversity into a legacy for others. In silence, she allowed herself to look back and review the path she'd traveled. From that morning when she left home with a suitcase and the feeling of being discarded, to this present where she was leading a respected and necessary project, everything had been marked by pain, resilience, and learning. She made no mistake. She knew there would still be challenges, that life would never be easy, but she no longer feared rejection or looks of contempt. She had built a place where once there had been humiliation, and no one could take that away. From her, that certainty gave her the peace of mind that, although her story had begun with abandon, it was now being written with dignity and strength of its own.